billionaire dead, until a tiny toddler did the unbelievable. The room was completely silent. The world's most powerful man, a 50-year-old billionaire who had built an empire from nothing, lay perfectly still on a cold hospital bed. His chest was not rising. His eyes were closed. The machines around him flatlined. One by one, 5 of the best doctors in the country stepped back. They removed their gloves. They shook their heads. And quietly, one of them said the words no one in that room ever expected to hear. "There is nothing more we can do." His staff stood frozen. His bodyguards were pale. The nurses had tears running down their faces. The man who had survived bankruptcies, enemies, and storms that would have destroyed lesser people was gone. Or so everyone believed. Then, from the far corner of the room, past the expensive machines, past the weeping adults, past all the power and the money and the grief, came the sound of tiny footsteps. A 3-year-old little girl, the daughter of his housekeeper. She had no idea what death meant. She only knew one thing, that the man in the bed looked sad and lonely, and nobody was holding his hand. So she walked straight up to him. She climbed onto the edge of the bed by herself. She placed her tiny little hand inside his giant, cold one, and she leaned close to his ear and whispered something so soft that nobody in that room could hear it. What happened next changed everything. Before we tell you this incredible story, we want to stop for just one moment and ask, where in the world are you watching this right now? Are you watching from the United States? Drop a United States, USA is here. United Kingdom, the Canada? Canada, Australia? Australia, India? India, Germany? Germany. Wherever you are in this beautiful world, we see you, we love you, and this story is for you. Because what happened between a 50-year-old billionaire and a 3-year-old child is something that no amount of money, no degree, and no power could ever explain. It is a story about the one thing that is more powerful than all of it combined. It is a story about love. Now settle in, because this one is going to stay with you for a long, long time. His name was Richard Calloway, and if you looked at his life from the outside, you would think, this man has it all. By the time he turned 50 years old, Richard had built one of the most successful business empires in the entire country. He started with absolutely nothing. He grew up in a small apartment in a rough neighborhood. His father, a factory worker, died young. His mother cleaned other people's houses to keep the lights on. Richard wore the same shoes to school for 2 years because there was no money for new ones. He ate peanut butter sandwiches every single day because that was all they could afford. But Richard had something that money could not buy, even back then. He had a mind that never stopped working, a fire inside him that nothing could put out, and a promise, a deep, silent promise he made to himself at 8 years old, standing in the kitchen watching his mother cry over unpaid bills, that one day things would be different. And they were. By 25, he had started his first company in a tiny office with secondhand furniture. By 30, that company had doubled in size. By 35, he had made his first million. By 40, he was worth more than most people could count. And by 50, by the day the story begins, Richard Calloway was worth over $4 billion. $4 billion. He had a mansion in Connecticut with 14 rooms, a private jet, cars that cost more than most people's homes, a staff of 30 people whose entire job was to make sure his life ran perfectly. But here's the thing about Richard Calloway that nobody mentioned in the Forbes profiles. Nobody brought up at the fancy dinners where he was always the most important man in the room. Richard Calloway was completely, utterly, devastatingly alone. He had been married once, briefly, in his mid-30s. But his wife could not compete with the one great love of his life, which was his work. She left after 3 years, and he could not honestly blame her. He had no children. His mother had passed away when he was 42, and that loss had broken something inside him that he never talked about and never fully repaired. He had colleagues, employees, People who smiled at him and laughed at his jokes and fought over seats at his dinner table. But he had no one who truly knew him, no one who saw him, no one who would sit beside him in a dark room just to be near him, without wanting anything in return. His house was quiet in the evenings in a way that felt less like peace and more like punishment. He would sit in his enormous study, surrounded by awards and books and the trappings of a successful life, and he would look at the empty chair across from his desk and feel an ache so deep and so old that it felt like it had always been there. He had built everything he promised himself he would build. And yet something was missing. He just didn't know what. Not yet. His housekeeper was a woman named Maria Velasquez. She had worked for Richard for 7 years. She was quiet, warm, deeply honest, a woman who had come from Mexico in her 20s and built a good life through hard work and dignity. She cared about doing a good job the way some people care about doing the right thing, because for Maria, they were always the same thing. Maria had a daughter named Sophia. Sophia was 3 years old. She had big brown eyes that took up half her face, dark curly hair her mother rustled into pigtails every morning, and a laugh that sounded like tiny bells ringing. She was at the beautiful age where everything in the world is a miracle, where a butterfly landing on a flower is worth stopping everything to watch, where a stranger smiling at you is enough to make your whole entire day. Maria sometimes brought Sophia to work when the babysitter was unavailable. On those days, Sophia would sit in the enormous kitchen with her coloring books and her little juice box. And somehow, that giant house would feel, just slightly, just faintly, like it had a heartbeat again. Richard had noticed Sophia before, in the distracted way that very busy people notice small children. A glance, a nod. He had never spoken to her, never knelt down to her level. He was not a cruel man. He simply did not know how. What Richard did not know was that Sophia had been watching him too. In the quiet, deep way that small children watch the adults around them, absorbing everything, missing nothing, seeing straight through expensive suits and important phone calls to the simple, raw truth underneath. She had seen him eat dinner alone at a table big enough for 12. She had seen him stand at the window in the evenings looking out at his beautiful garden with an expression on his face she didn't have a word for yet, but that made her tiny chest feel heavy. She had seen him pick up his phone to call someone and then put it back down without dialing. And one afternoon, when she was sitting on the kitchen floor with her crayons and Richard walked past without noticing her, she looked straight up at him and said, in a completely fearless way that only very young children can manage, "Why are you always by yourself?" Richard stopped walking. He looked down at this tiny person asking him the most honest question anyone had asked him in years. He laughed, a short, uncomfortable laugh. He said something like, "I like being by myself." And then he walked away. But he thought about that question for days, weeks even. Why are you always by yourself? He thought about it at his desk, on his jet, in the middle of meetings where millions of dollars were being discussed, while Sophia's small voice played on repeat in the back of his mind like a song he could not stop hearing. He had no answer. Not yet. It was a Tuesday in November when Richard Calloway collapsed. He had been feeling unwell for weeks, but he was the kind of man who pushed through everything, through illness, through pain, through exhaustion, with sheer, stubborn force of will. His doctor had looked him in the eye 6 months earlier and used words like dangerously elevated and significant cardiac risk, and "You need to slow down, Richard." Richard had nodded, made the right sounds, and then gotten right back on his jet to fly to the next meeting. He was 50 years old, and he had never once stopped. Not for illness, not for heartbreak, not for grief, not for loneliness, not for a single human thing that tried to slow him down. His body had been keeping a quiet, patient score. It happened at 7 in the morning. He was standing in his study, on a call with someone in London, coffee in one hand and a pen in the other, when something changed. A feeling unlike anything he had ever felt before. Not pain exactly, but a sudden, total wrongness, spread from the center of his chest outward through his whole body like a wave. The phone slipped from his hand. The coffee fell. His knees buckled. And Richard Calloway, the man who had never fallen down for anything, hit the floor. Maria was in the kitchen when she heard it. The thud, the crash of the mug, the terrible silence that followed. She ran down the hallway and found him on the floor, pale as chalk, completely still. She screamed for the security staff. She called 911 with shaking hands. She knelt beside him and held his hand and talked to him, talked and talked, saying, "Mr. Calloway, stay with me, please stay with me," because she was that kind of woman. Sophia had been sitting in the kitchen. She heard her mother scream. She came padding down the hallway in her little socks and peeked through the study door and saw the man on the floor and her mother crying, and she did not understand what was happening, but she felt the fear in the air the way children always do, like a cold wind coming under a door. The ambulance came in 7 minutes. Richard was rushed to the hospital. He was alive, barely, and the team of doctors who met him in the emergency room worked on him for over an hour. What they found was devastating. His heart had suffered a massive attack. The damage was severe. They performed emergency procedures to stabilize him, and for a while, for a frightening, desperate while, it seemed to be working. His readings improved slightly. His color came back just a little, and the doctors allowed themselves one small breath of cautious hope. But then, in the early hours of the following morning, everything changed again. His condition deteriorated suddenly and completely. The numbers on the monitors began dropping. His body was shutting down in ways the machines could not stop. The doctors worked frantically. Every tool, every medication, every procedure they had. They worked without stopping. They worked past exhaustion. And then, one by one, they stopped. The lead doctor, a man who had spent 30 years saving lives, a man who had seen everything, stepped back from the bed. He took a long breath. He looked at his colleagues. And quietly he said, "There is nothing more we can do." Maria was in the waiting room when the doctor came to speak with her. She was the emergency contact. She was the closest thing Richard had to family at that moment, his housekeeper of 7 years who he had never once called a friend, but who had loved him quietly and faithfully from a respectful distance for all of those 7 years. She collapsed into her chair when they told her. Sophia was with her. She had fallen asleep in the waiting room chair, her small body curled up under Maria's jacket. When her mother's crying woke her, she sat up and looked around with sleepy, confused eyes. She didn't understand the words the doctor was saying, but she understood her mother's face. And she understood that something very, very sad had happened to the man who always ate dinner alone. Maria, through her tears, explained it the only way you can explain death to a 3-year-old. She said that Mr. Calloway was very sick, that his heart was tired, that he was sleeping in a way that might not end. Sophia listened with her big brown eyes wide open. Then she slid off her chair. She took her mother's hand, and she said very seriously, "I want to go see him, Mama." Maria almost said no. What was the point? The doctors had said there was nothing more to be done. He was unconscious. He couldn't hear anything or feel anything or know that anyone was there. But Sophia tugged on her hand again, and the look on her face, that small, serious, completely certain face, made Maria stand up. They walked together down the long hospital corridor. Maria pushed open the door to Richard's room. The machines were still running, still beeping softly, but there was a different feeling in the room now, a heaviness, a held breath, the particular quiet of a room where hope has just left. The nurses stepped back. The remaining staff stood still. Sophia walked in without hesitation. She walked right up to the bed, this giant white bed where the most powerful man in the world lay still and pale and small. She reached up both arms. She could not get up on her own. Maria lifted her daughter and set her on the edge of the bed. And Sophia, 3 years old, took Richard Calloway's large, cold hand in both of her tiny, warm ones. She held it gently, carefully, the way she held things she loved. She leaned close to his face. She put her lips near his ear, and she whispered, Nobody in that room could hear what she said. Not Maria. Not the nurses. Nobody. For a long moment, absolutely nothing happened. And then something did. His finger moved. Just one finger. The index finger of his right hand, the hand that Sophia was holding. It moved, just barely, just slightly, but it moved. And in that room full of people who had just been told that moving was no longer possible, that tiny movement was like a thunderclap. One of the nurses made a sound. Another leaned forward. Maria pressed both hands over her mouth. Then the monitor changed. The numbers, the terrible dropping numbers that had sent the doctors stepping back, shifted. Just a fraction. Just enough to see. But they shifted upward instead of down. Richard's heart rate, which had been slowing towards silence, did something that none of the medical equipment in that room could explain. It steadied. The doctor who had declared him beyond help was called back into the room. He stood at the bedside and stared at the monitors and then stared at the small child sitting on the edge of the bed holding his patient's hand. And he had no words. He was a man of science. 30 years of science. And science had nothing to say about what he was seeing. Sophia did not look up. She did not notice the commotion around her. She was focused completely on Richard, in the total, undistracted way that very small children focus on the things that matter to them. She was still talking to him, softly, quietly, a continuous soft murmur that nobody could make out, and she was stroking the back of his hand with her thumb the way her mother stroked her hand when she was scared. Over the next 2 hours, Richard Calloway did something that the medical team would later struggle to put into words in their reports. He came back. It was not dramatic, not the way it is in movies. It was slow and fragile and uncertain, like a candle flame in a breeze that might go out at any moment, but somehow doesn't. His readings continued to improve. His color shifted from gray to pale. His breathing, which had been barely there, deepened just enough to see his chest rising and falling. Sophia stayed on that bed for the entire 2 hours. Maria tried twice, gently, to take her home. Both times, Sophia shook her head and held on tighter to Richard's hand. She would not leave him alone. At some point in the second hour, Richard's eyes opened. Not fully, not clearly, just a slow, heavy flutter of eyelids, like a person surfacing from a very deep and very dark place. His eyes were unfocused at first. The ceiling, the lights, the blurred shapes of the people around him. And then his eyes found the small face next to his. Sophia looked right back at him. She did not look frightened or excited or overwhelmed. She looked exactly the way she had looked the day she asked him, "Why are you always by yourself?" Calm, direct, completely certain that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She patted his hand.
"Hi," she said.
Just that. Just one small word. And Richard Calloway, the 50-year-old billionaire who had not cried since his mother's funeral 8 years ago, felt his eyes fill with tears. He could not speak yet. His throat would not cooperate. He was still too far from full consciousness, still too fragile, still too new to being alive again in a way he had not expected to be. But he looked at Sophia's face, and he felt something that he had not felt in so many years that he had almost forgotten the word for it. He felt held. Not by money, not by success, not by achievements stacked up like trophies on a shelf. Held by this, by a pair of tiny warm hands and a small face looking at him without any judgment, without any agenda, without anything at all except the simple intention of making sure he was not alone. The doctors worked through the night. It was cautious, careful, one step at a time work. But by morning, Richard Calloway was stable. Truly stable. The kind of stable that let the doctors, carefully, professionally, use the word recovery. Nobody could explain it completely. The medical reports would note the improvement and list the interventions and attribute it to a combination of factors. But every single person who had been in that room knew something the reports would never fully capture. The little girl had called him back. Somehow, in some way that lived beyond the reach of science and medicine and the rational explanation of things, Sophia's whisper had reached him somewhere deep and unreachable, in whatever dark place he had been drifting toward. And it had turned him around. Maria did not sleep that night. She sat in the chair beside Richard's bed, because no one else was there to sit in it, and she held her sleeping daughter in her arms and she prayed. She prayed in Spanish, quietly, the prayers her own mother had taught her when she was small. She thanked God. She thanked the doctors. And she thanked her 3-year-old daughter, who had walked into a room full of grief and done the only thing she knew how to do. She had not let him be alone. 3 days after Richard Calloway woke up, when he was strong enough to sit up and speak and hold a proper conversation, he asked to see Sophia. Maria brought her to the hospital room in the afternoon. Sophia was wearing a yellow dress, and her hair was in the pigtails her mother always did, and she carried under her arm a drawing she had made, a scribbled, crayon picture of what appeared to be 2 people holding hands under a very large sun. She climbed up onto the hospital bed without being invited, which made the nurse who had come in to check on things start slightly and then smile. Richard looked down at this small person sitting comfortably on his hospital bed like she owned it, holding out her drawing for him to see. And he laughed, a real laugh, a warm one, the kind he hadn't heard come out of himself in a very long time. "Is that for me?" he asked. Sophia nodded very seriously. "That's you," she said, pointing to the taller scribble. "And that's me." She pointed to the smaller one. "We're holding hands." Richard took the drawing carefully. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he looked at Sophia. "I need to ask you something," he said. "When you came to see me when I was sleeping, you whispered something in my ear. Do you remember what you said?" Sophia thought about it. She scrunched up her nose the way children do when they are thinking hard. Then she looked up at him with those big brown eyes. "I told you not to go," she said simply. Richard was quiet for a moment. "That's all." Sophia thought again. "I told you I would miss you." She paused. "And I told you that you still had to find your person." The room went completely still. Maria, sitting in the chair in the corner, brought her hand to her heart. Richard stared at Sophia. "My person," he repeated. Sophia nodded like this was perfectly obvious. "Everybody needs a person," she said. "Mama is my person, and I'm her person. You don't have a person yet." She tilted her head. "I told you you had to stay and find them." Richard could not speak for a very long moment. This 3-year-old child, this small, fearless, impossibly wise 3-year-old, had reached into whatever darkness he was sinking into and pulled him back with the simplest truth in the world. "You haven't found your person yet. You have to stay." He looked at the crayon drawing in his hands. 2 scribbled figures under a giant yellow sun, holding hands. "Sophia," he said, his voice rougher than usual, "can I ask you something else?" She looked at him. "Why did you come to see me?" "The doctors said I was gone. Everyone was crying. Why did you come?" Sophia looked at him like the answer was the most obvious thing in the world. "Because you were by yourself," she said. "You're always by yourself. And nobody should be by themselves when they're scared." Richard Calloway pressed his lips together. He nodded very slowly. He looked down at the crayon drawing one more time. And then, for the second time in 3 days, this man who had not cried in 8 years, he cried. He cried the way people cry when they have been holding something in for a very, very long time and the dam finally breaks. He cried for his mother and for his marriage and for all the empty chairs at all the empty dinner tables. He cried for the phone he had picked up 100 times and put back down without calling anyone. He cried for the boy he had been, who made a promise to himself about money and success and forgot to make a promise about belonging. Sophia watched him cry. She did not look alarmed. She did not look like she didn't know what to do. She scooted across the bed and leaned against his arm. She put her small head against his side, and she let him cry. Richard Calloway spent 11 days in the hospital. They were the strangest 11 days of his life, because for the first time in decades, he had absolutely nowhere to be. No meetings, no calls he had to take, no deals that couldn't wait. For 11 days, Richard Calloway was simply a man in a bed, with time to think, and a small girl who came to visit him every afternoon. Sophia came every single day that Maria worked. She would climb up on his bed. She would show him her drawings. She would tell him about the butterfly she had seen in the parking lot, and the funny thing the hospital dog had done in the lobby, and the song her mother had sung to her that morning. She talked with the pure, joyful confidence of a child who has never once doubted that what she has to say is worth listening to. And Richard listened. He listened the way he had not listened to another person in years, not with half his mind on the next problem, but completely, fully, with his whole attention. He started to understand something during those 11 days. He had spent 50 years building companies, building wealth, building a life that looked from the outside like a monument to success. And he had done all of that building completely alone because he had believed, deep down somewhere he had never quite examined, that needing people was a weakness, that depending on others was a vulnerability that someone who had come from nothing could not afford. A 3-year-old had dismantled that belief in about 48 hours. Because Sophia needed people, she needed her mother, she needed kindness, she needed someone to look at her drawings and listen to her stories, and she was the most fearless, most certain, most unbreakable small person he had ever met. Her need for love was not her weakness. It was her power. It was the very thing that had walked her into a room full of grief and straight up to a dying man's bedside without hesitation. She needed people, so she went and found them. Richard had always thought he was the strong one in any room. For the first time in his life, sitting in a hospital bed with a 3-year-old leaning against his arm, he understood that he had it backwards. When he was discharged from the hospital, Richard Calloway made changes. Not the small, temporary changes that people make in the first weeks after a health scare, the ones that fade by the time the fear fades. Real changes. Structural changes. The kind that require looking honestly at the life you have built and deciding, with clear eyes, which parts of it actually matter. He stepped back from the company. Not entirely, he had built it from nothing and it was part of who he was, but he stepped back from the grinding, relentless pace that had been slowly eroding everything good. He hired a president to run the day-to-day operations. He started working 4 days a week instead of 7. He stopped taking calls after 8 in the evening. He called people he had neglected, old friendships that had gone quiet because he had never made time for them. He called them, really called, not to network, not to make deals, just to talk. And he was honest about why he had been absent, and he was grateful, genuinely grateful, when most of them were still there to pick up the phone. He started eating dinner at the big table in his dining room. Not alone. He started inviting people. His assistant, who had worked for him for 9 years and whom he suddenly realized he knew almost nothing about as a person. His old college roommate, who lived 40 minutes away and whom he had not seen in 3 years. Maria and Sophia, who came on Sunday afternoons and for whom Richard always made sure the kitchen was stocked with Sophia's favorite juice boxes and the particular brand of crackers she liked. Those Sunday afternoons became something Richard quietly treasured in a way he did not fully have words for. Watching Sophia color at his kitchen table, listening to Maria talk about her week, feeling the house be less like a monument and more like a home. He also did something that took more courage than any business deal he had ever made. He started therapy. He was 50 years old, and he had never once sat in a room and said out loud the things that lived in the quiet corners of himself. He was uncomfortable at first, deeply, almost unbearably uncomfortable, in the way that people who have spent a lifetime being strong are uncomfortable when asked to be vulnerable. But he stayed. Week after week, he stayed. And slowly, with a patience he had learned from watching a 3-year-old hold a dying man's hand, he started to understand the shape of the loneliness he had been carrying for so long. And one more thing. 6 months after leaving the hospital, Richard Calloway sat down with Maria and told her that he wanted to support Sophia's education. All of it, preschool, school, college, everything completely taken care of. A trust fund, set up properly, unconditional. Maria tried to say no. She was proud in the way that deeply good people are proud. She had never taken anything she hadn't earned. Richard looked at her for a long moment. "You saved my life," he said. "Both of you did. Not the doctors. You and your daughter." Maria's eyes filled with tears. "I have $4 billion, Richard said quietly. "And for 50 years, I did not know what it was for. Now I do." 1 year after the day that the doctors said Richard Calloway was gone, 1 year after a tiny girl climbed onto a hospital bed and held a dying man's hand and whispered him back into the world, Richard did something he had never done before in his public life. He told a story. Not in a press release. Not through a spokesperson. He sat down in front of a camera in his study, with Sophia's crayon drawing framed on the wall behind him, the two scribbled figures holding hands under a giant yellow sun, and he told everything. He told it plainly, with no performance and no polish, in the honest voice of a man who has stopped pretending. He talked about the loneliness, the empty chairs, the phone calls he never made. He talked about the morning he fell. He talked about waking up in the hospital room to find a pair of tiny warm hands holding his. He talked about the whisper he could not hear that somehow reached him anyway. He talked about what Sophia had told him. You still have to find your person. Nobody should be by themselves when they're scared. The millions, every country, in every language, were filled with people who recognized something in what Richard was saying. People who were also eating dinner alone at tables too big. People who were also picking up the phone and putting it back down without calling. People who were also building and achieving and succeeding and somehow, quietly, feeling like something was still missing. Sophia did not watch the video because she was 3.5 years old and more interested in her coloring books. But if she had watched it, she probably would not have understood why everyone was making such a big deal about it. To her, she had simply done the obvious thing. Someone was alone and scared, so she went to be with them. That's it. That's the whole story. The thing that no doctor could do, no medication could achieve, no amount of money or power or technology in that hospital could manage. A child did with 2 small hands and 8 whispered words. Don't go. I'll miss you. You still need to find your person. There is something that very small children know that the rest of us spend our whole lives trying to remember. They have not yet learned to protect themselves from meeting people. They have not yet learned to be embarrassed about love or cautious about kindness or guarded about the simple act of reaching out and taking someone's hand. They do not yet know about being too busy or too important or too far past the point of softness. They only know what they feel. And what Sophia felt, looking at a man who was always by himself, was simple. He needs someone to be with him. So she went. Richard Calloway is still alive today. He walks a little slower since his heart attack, and he works a little less, and he laughs a little more. On Sunday afternoons, if you drove past his 14-room mansion in Connecticut, you might see a little girl with dark pigtails and big brown eyes running around his garden while her mother sits on the porch, and the man who used to eat alone at a table for 12 grills something on the back deck and calls out to ask if anyone wants lemonade. The table still seats 12, but it is never empty anymore. Sophia turned 4 last spring. Richard threw her a birthday party in the back garden. The whole garden strung with lights, a cake with a butterfly on it because butterflies are her current favorite thing, and a small crowd of people who, a year ago, had not yet found their way into each other's lives. At one point during the party, Sophia ran up to Richard and grabbed his hand and pulled him toward the garden. "Come see," she said. "There's a butterfly." He let her pull him, this small, serious person who had reached into the dark and pulled him back into the light. He let her show him the butterfly, a small orange one sitting on the edge of the garden wall, and he stood there in the afternoon sun and looked at it with her, really looked, the way you look at things when you finally understand they are worth looking at. "It's beautiful," he said. Sophia looked up at him with her big brown eyes. Then she smiled the smile that sounded like bells. "I know," she said. "I see them all the time. You just have to stop and look." He has not forgotten that. He never will. If this story, and remember, Sometimes the most powerful thing in the world is simply making sure someone doesn't have to be alone.